All right, this is our last individual presentation, then we'll have a short discussion, and then we'll move on. Our final discussion is our next to final. Matt Sweeney, you met earlier from the panel discussion, had a lot of good cogent comments and ideas. And his topic is cyber behavior, physical and virtual, and it's almost ready. Let's see what you do with it. Matt, thanks. Do you want to use this or that?
I'll give it a shot with this guy. I tend to roam too. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Michael mentioned, I'm Matt Sweeney. I'm from SRC. Hopefully, during the talk today, we'll touch on some things that are novel. Since I'm at the end of the tail run here, I won't emphasize anything about PFC Manning or Edward Snowden or anything else, so they might show up on the list here. But the real thing I want to talk about here today is, over the course of years of research, mostly focused on insider threat detection and personnel security issues, certain things have come up regarding what is the relationship between adverse online behavior and personnel security. There's often discussion of, okay, personnel security is part of the insider threat scenario. There's discussion that online behaviors are part of the insider threat scenario. There's not a lot of discussion of the interplay between all these things, and that's what I want to touch on a little bit today, and hopefully we can have some discussion about what the relationship between those things are. So looking at what do we know regarding patterns of things related to work and non-work activities, being able to raise awareness of some of the psychological connections. And as I go through this here, I'll be hopping along at a high level in some of these things, but if you're interested in more detailed discussion, I'd be happy to have further conversation with you. So we'll hit on here, what are the trends in adverse online behavior that we've seen? What are some of the online behaviors that most often seem related to certain offline aspects or categorized as that way when we're looking at personal security clearance issues and background investigations in general, and how can online behavior be incorporated into personnel security and insider threat. So won't touch heavily on this, but just want to highlight this more from the perspective of what are some of the background conditions that led to some of these insider threat attacks. So in the case of Ames and Hansen, there's a certain amount of hubris involved in their attacks. There's a certain euphoria in their being able to execute their attack, and they were able to lie successfully under polygraph. So these are issues that are, get to the core of how do we figure out what's going on with some of these insider threat activities? How do we balance we have to detect what's going on online with how do we understand what's going on in the physical world? In the case of Snowden, he felt this moral obligation and disaffection all at the same time to execute his activities, or evolving story. So as that goes, and in the case of employees, in the case of Citigroup, there's an instance where an employee was stealing from multiple clients, including her own father, and went undetected, not because there weren't insider threat detection mechanisms in place from a computer security standpoint, from database audit standpoint, from the manager even reviewing materials, but there was a predisposition not to confront her about it, and there was a certain predisposition that she had. She had background conditions in her life that led her to need money. And so if we're looking at any one of these things in isolation, you might say, well, I missed this or I missed that. And so based on some of our earlier discussions today, there's the importance of all these different pieces in our lives tend to add up. And if you look at a static view of what trust and security mean, then you're going to miss certain aspects of how to protect against the insider threat. I'm not going to read all this. But what I want to highlight is actually the first thing here is a study that folks at CMU CERT conducted with several other researchers from Syracuse University and elsewhere regarding the system dynamics of insider threat. And one of the key things that came out of that I found interesting was this interplay between trust in the organization and trust in the individual who's helping that organization to operate. So there's, I guess, this balance of how do you find the appropriate level of trust so that you don't impinge upon people's what they feel like is personal space, that discussion of privacy and everything else. If I have to ask 1,000 questions of an employee before I'll let them work for me, am I going to be able to hire that best person because they decide, that company over there, they're not going to do that to me. So I'm going to move over there. But at the same time, protecting systems and functions enough so that when that one person that's there that has been, not performing well and has been decided, the company made a decision to let them go. They don't decide to blow up everything, and the company is protected from that. So working on down the line here, the key aspects of what I'm highlighting here, an increasing rate of folks who are young. This actually builds on a lot of talks during the day, so I'm glad I'm last. The whole Generation Y thing, people report engaging in more and more deviant online behavior, so hacking, cracking into people's accounts, sharing passwords, or not stealing passwords, being able to disclose privileged information or confidential information, and feeling more comfortable doing that on the internet. People who might otherwise feel like, I don't want to share information about what I think about a certain topic or subject, can find collaborators or cohorts online and not feel like they need to tell anybody else about that, because they don't have to go physically somewhere to meet, or it's not a noticeable activity. So all the typical things you might share during a background investigation discussion, they don't show up because you say, no, on Thursdays I don't go and visit with these people over there. It's all virtual. And then the addictive nature of web behavior. So the internet addictions being more common among those with mental disorders is an interesting fact, I think, and using that as an escape. So viewing virtual behavior as a means of escaping your own circumstances, and then being able to provide false or derogatory information through assumed identity. So these are all this blanket list of concerns that I probably should have summarized differently, but in any case, you get the idea that there's a lot of factors running into, sensation-seeking, psychoticism, internet addiction causing loneliness and shyness. These are all different factors that factor into whether personnel security concerns exist, and also on an ongoing basis, what does the landscape look like for people as they enter the workforce. So this is just a pictograph showing what, from our perspective, holistic security awareness looks like. And you have aspects of personnel security, but organizations are also trying to optimize workflow and collaboration. So you have issues there, and you also have issues along the lines of, how do I best maintain cybersecurity while partnering and competing with other organizations? And from the perspective of adverse online behavior, what we want to understand is, how do the behaviors that I engage with, the risk that I accept when offering somebody a clearance, access to certain information, employment at an organization, what kind of risk am I accepting, and what is the interplay there in all these things? So what I'm going to share is a few things that we learned from a study of adverse online behavior, and we'll just be going over real quick the goals and objectives, how we went about it, some research findings and limitations and recommendations resulting from that. The high-level thing we're looking to do is define adverse online behaviors, for one thing. So this is not a necessarily well-defined topic. There's not a lot of taxonomies on there. We had to work with different pieces of information from other researchers and define our own. But getting rates of prevalence for these kinds of behaviors is difficult too, because the most often sampled subjects are college students. So okay, so that's one part of the population, but we already know that Gen Yers, as indicated before, they're more likely to engage in these sorts of activities. So what does the overall population look like? Identifying indicators of these adverse online behaviors from a psychological perspective. So there's often a correlation between the types of activities that were exhibited. So if you look at I won't be showing the low-level details here, but the particular behaviors that were engaged in, folks might say, well, I am the owner of this website. I'm the admin of this forum. I'm the one who creates all the content. I'm in charge of it. And so you get a certain sense of behavioral aspects of this person and how they expect to engage with others when they're put in a position of control as well. And so these are all things that when you look at the whole person as far as well insider threat occur, there are things to take into consideration that aren't necessarily part of any particular process as far as whether it's background investigations at companies or the SF-86 as it exists right now. So we analyzed about 50,000 cases and came up with about 33,000 that were usable in the course of the study, and went looking through those electronically through natural language processing analytics to identify adverse online behaviors. And what we did was, through that process, categorize behaviors, mentions of those behaviors as we looked through them, and then analyze some of the trends over time. we made an attempt at predictive models, but that's more for the purpose of really identifying links between particular behaviors as they were mentioned. So we defined 47 different categories of adverse online behavior. Found 3,000 cases that had that behavior, and there's really a triad here of related concepts of we have problematic cyber behaviors, we have typical security risk indicators as are defined in government standards like the ICD 704.2, and there's mental disorder traits, which we keyed in on based on what was mentioned really in the, so this is taking a look through all 3,000 cases and actually examining what are people saying, how are they talking about what they're engaging in online. And some examples of this adverse online behavior, at a high level when we say, other serious misuse of IT systems, I want to give example of, let's see, do I have that in here? No, I don't. Being able to share information online, pirate information, steal passwords, steal accounts, do all these other kinds of things. There's just a lot of activities that were found, and including hacking. So let's take a look here. So one thing that we found, I'll take a look at this infographic first. So over the course of time, so this is the relative proportion of cases that had mention of adverse online behavior. So there was a definite trend that over the course of time, more people were entering the workforce and are looking for a security clearance, and they had these types of behaviors mentioned in their reports. The funny thing is there's very little about this. The SF-86 modifications in 2008 and 2010 have a couple questions related to, what do you do with online systems? But there's nothing about what are your typical behaviors online? How do you engage with people on the internet? What's your typical frequency of use with virtual games, online play, all these other areas of behavior that really relate to, am I addicted to the internet? Do I have a problem with online gambling? Do I have an issue with other types of things? So in the case of some of these categories of behavior here, stealing online identity, monitoring other people's electronic communications, hacking into their computers, that sort of thing, there's a lot of serious issues that begin to arise. And then during the course of our analysis, we found that adverse online behaviors often indicated an increased security risk as well. So as far as conclusions that we can get out of this, it's definitely AOB is a growing issue. I think everyone would agree on that, but sometimes when you're confronted with, okay, there's thousands and thousands of cases, and we know that there's a definite increase in this kind of behavior, and yet our current, both corporate and government policies addressing this issue don't in any way touch on what online behaviors exist in people's lives. Seems like there's kind of a gap there. And so one of the things we highlight here is, there needs to be better data collection, and that's one of the limitations of our study as well, is we're relying on information that's collected during the course of these investigations. Well, if you're, as been mentioned previously, if you're not really allowed to deviate much from what's in the SF-86 and actually go down the route of even fairly innocuous questions like, what is one of your online pseudonyms? And if it's, Happy Kitty 79, then, never mind. So there's just some things that people share about themselves in virtual environments that, like I said, they wouldn't be comfortable with otherwise. So better data collection is something that's of interest. So what we did, we actually have a detailed report outlining guidelines as far as all the different adverse online behavior, what other kinds of physical behavior were observed in the course of, that were connected with this in any way based on statistical analysis, and then seeing different examples. So if somebody said, well, I created a false AOL account and then sent information to this other person over here, I installed a keystroke logger on my professor's computer and then got the information needed in order to steal all of the students' reports, and then was able to plagiarize them for my own benefit. All these kind of things exist here, and so there's other related activities as well. So you mentioned the associated offline behaviors. There's often interesting interconnections between when you start looking at, okay, if I start living in a virtual world, and if there's issues with addiction or immediacy of information access, they start to touch on other personnel areas. And so this is just something for general awareness of folks who are dealing with folks coming from a generation that are entirely connected to the internet all the time, and that there's certain, I think, psychological issues that are present there that our country as a whole isn't dealing with. it's good to bring better awareness about that. So I guess there's other when you talk about the depression and anxiety and other things, you see, okay, and alcohol consumption and drug involvement and other things are associated with certain kinds of online use, then that gives you a little bit better picture of what's going on. I'm going to skip over this for right now, and actually, in order to allow room for questions, because I'm talking too much, I'm going to zip through past a few things, but just mainly to mention that there's a few, this other serious misuse of IT systems. That's actually a catch-all for several different areas that we kind of had to group together, because otherwise it would have been lots of individual things. But the topics that are interesting, you can see there's definitely trends upward in some of the less frequent. These are all the less frequent adverse online behaviors. And you notice in earlier areas of the study they weren't picked up on as much. Probably some training happened in here. Somebody said, hey, we need to address these things in more detail. But there's definitely increases in areas of hacking. Communications fraud becomes more prevalent versus what it was before. So there's definitely pieces that pick up and should be something that people incorporate into their processes organizationally. I'm going to skip over that too. So this was over an 8-year period. There are definite trends that we noticed. The other serious misuse is really things we would categorize as deviant behavior. So anything where you're stealing somebody's information, somebody's access, control, manipulating information, destroying information, all that falls under that category. There was a definite trend upward in that category. The illegal downloading of information and participation in virtual worlds. So this is just another area to pay attention to, that if I'm asking neighbors about where Mike or Joe or whoever spends his time, and I'm not asking any of the people who he interacts with on a virtual world, and I don't even ask him, do you participate in social media, virtual worlds, whatever else, you're missing out on a lot, and that's hampering any of the background investigation process. In the case of Edward Snowden, he was on Ars Technica, very well-known user there, and he told about all kinds of things, including his love life. I mean, he shared all sorts of stuff that you would just never share, probably even with your neighbors, but just he was never asked about those sorts of things either, so we won't know if anyone would have found that information. And I just had the DEF CON kids here because I think it's interesting that, the increase in hacking-related activities, and now DEF CON is not, geared toward teaching, it's more white hat kind of hacking, but it's still, it's interesting to note that as I think the workforce evolves, those skills are of increased prevalence. Those are boring graphs. So the results of what we have here, if folks are interested, we have a taxonomy of adverse online behaviors that we developed. We developed guidelines for the relevance of each of these behaviors with respect to personnel security. And we also developed a psychological questionnaire. So for each of these 47 categories of adverse online behavior, we made a mapping to several different categories in the DSM manual so that we could try and figure out what are the particular psychological issues that might be associated with each one of these adverse online behaviors, and then tie that back into particular questions that could be asked that are fairly innocuous. We gave examples like, do you post videos online? Would I have access to those? Things that are not necessarily invading privacy, but they're just giving you an indication of what kind of profile does this person have. I get a base profile and a level of risk so that when I accept this person into my organization, I know what I'm getting into. Do you pay for any kind of access to sites online or on the internet? That sort of thing. And quick mention on limitations. So like I said, a lot of this information is coming in and not necessarily with adverse online behavior in mind. And the policy on handling that is not consistent because people aren't used to understanding what are the security implications of this right now. So how can I actually relate this to what security risk is? So overall, based on what we found in this study, being able to develop a policy for communication with current potential staff about what online behavior includes, and even having psychologists on staff and available, so that even if it's anonymous talks there, that there can be some kind of anonymous transfer of information that doesn't violate HR rules, but allows an employer to know, I have certain issues related to internet addiction, fraud, online gambling, all these other things that are present in my company, and I need to provide services for people to get help with those. I need to have protections in place so that I know and understand where people are visiting online, all those sorts of things. Because a lot of these pieces of information, say the adverse online behavior, it's really a cyclical kind of beneficial thing. If I understand what's going on coming in to the organization, that helps. If I'm trying to understand what's going on from a forensic cyber insider threat detection standpoint, and I have certain key adverse online behaviors that I can target, that helps me develop policy around what I should actually monitor and what should be done in order to protect against those kind of behaviors. So all these things can work together. And based on some of what we found too, we think that even though it's not perfect information, it's not enough to say we have proven that there are all these links and correlations. There are a lot of relationships between certain physical behaviors and online behaviors. And I think it would be helpful just even for background investigators or HR staff to know, okay, if I hear about this from an employee, I might want to ask these 3 other questions too, just as a leading way of helping people to understand what's going on in the online world of employees' lives without invading it. And that's pretty much it. Just this idea of continuous employee assessment. There's a lot of discussion about cyber continuous monitoring and being able to continuously evaluate what the status is in audit logs and what the cyber insider threat perspective looks like. There's not a lot of discussion about that as far as employee assessment. People's lives are not static. People's lives change. When you trust somebody when they're 22 years old and enter the organization, you accept certain risks, but then they have a family and kids and parents that might pass away, or a dog that gets hit by a car, or they get a gambling problem or whatever else. And if there's not a serious look at continuously assessing that information, you're finding out years after something happened and not incorporating all aspects of that person, including online behaviors, then you have a limited picture of what's going on. And that's pretty much it. Any questions? Oh, thank you. That would be helpful.
Okay, so any discussion, questions, or other? Oh, all righty, I'll go right here.
Yeah, would you care to define a little further what you mean by internet addiction? When some people, that's their entire job, is doing stuff on the internet.
Sure.
Yeah, and tie that into your statement that the trends, there's a counterproductive trend going downward and misuse of IT systems going upward.
Okay.
It seems if counterproductive trend is downward, and people are more and more on the internet, that the trend would be going the other way.
Yeah. Again, this is just in the data set that we have, so I won't claim universal applicability there. But, sorry, first question again was in the realm of internet addiction. So in the course of our study, we broke things down based on work and non-work related functions. And so that was how we defined things. So as it's mentioned in reports, if somebody says that somebody was spending, in addition to their job function, 60 hours a week on World of Warcraft, then that generates some kind of concern. Okay, this person's never getting any sleep, and they're also interacting with people from all over the world, and they might not be very careful about how they're engaging in conversation or what they're saying. So there's just particular security risks that present themselves there. So in the case of addictions, there's also, if it affected work activity, so if somebody's, when you're talking about different kinds of materials being shared or downloaded onto their computer, and if they're doing it when they're not being able to be supervised by anybody else, and all these other things, there's indications that they're avoiding accountability and other things like that. So that's using work facilities for non-work functions related to that behavior that's mentioned elsewhere. So we counted it that way, and also just if you're in non-work time and you're spending so counterproductive. Say the counterproductive misuse of IT might involve, I spend too much time shopping on, whatever website or whatever series. I'm always on Amazon.com, but internet addiction, which can take a form of addiction as far as shopping or whatever else. But if I'm looking at other. It's not necessarily addiction when we're talking counterproductive use. So if somebody fell in the category of they spent all their workday doing that, or a significant part of their workday, that would fall under the category of addiction. But if you're just spending small amounts of time every so often, counterproductive misuse. As far as those trends go, I think that was potentially not that the total numbers went down, but that the proportions changed. So, and I don't know if I shared that cleanly enough in the data there, but that the proportion of the misuse, inappropriate use of IT deviant behaviors, that went up over time, whereas the counterproductive misuse declined proportionally to what it had been before. Any other questions?
Other ideas?
Yeah, so my question was about the 47 different categories that you classify as adverse online behavior. So where did you come up with this? Like, how did you enumerate
Why 47?
Yeah, why 47? I mean, can new things be introduced? Or,
That's
you know,
a
I also
prime
saw,
number. No.
I mean, and I think it's sort of is it binary? Or is it like a sliding scale where if I engage in more of hacking activities, does that constitute in more adverse than if I just buy and shop online? I mean, I would see the two as more.
As far as an additive effect, you mean, of the different behaviors?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
There's lots of things that we didn't evaluate. But I think what you say is true. You know, from the aspect of the cyber behavior assessment questionnaire that we have, it is an additive effect. So you're getting points based on how you answer certain questions, and so that helps influence where's the risk associated with your online activities. That's why we had to sort of break into parts, because the data that we had available to us, like I said, there's sort of a sampling problem as far as how the data is being collected, and so we don't get real validity from the data, and we don't get ground truth as far as insider threat either. You know, there's no direct correlation there, and we even want to be careful about, you know, if clearances are granted with high risk, you know, activities being present. That happens all the time at regular corporations, right? Somebody's got a drinking problem, but Fred is the best at doing this, and so we let him have his drinking problem, and as long as he comes in every day, punches in at 8, leaves at 5. Everybody's happy, right? I mean, it happens, you know, not necessarily as much now as maybe it used to, but I mean, that's not unheard of. And I think the same thing happens if there's a need, you know, risk is accepted. And, but from the perspective of the 47 categories, those are really just based on a combination of some background research we did and observations in the data. So it was really because we couldn't find anything like this that existed, so we surveyed the psychological, socio-behavioral literature on what kinds of problems might exist in our population at the current point in time, and then what are the actual relationships between these different categories as they relate to personnel security risk. Could there be a better 47 categories? Probably. But yeah, and that's what, as far as, dovetailing into the next discussion about research, I think this area isn't necessarily well understood, or that there are concrete categories of how I should relate online behavior activity to the current personnel security guidelines and understanding what the real risk and threats are. So, yeah. Did I address all your? Okay.
Going once. Any other ideas? Matthew, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.